Dr. Carroll,
Thank you.
let's
Yeah.
have you take it over.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here on your campus. Thanks a lot for showing me around and giving me an orientation. Appreciate that, picking me up at the airport. I did think it was cold here, but come with the heat wave, so that's great. I'm thrilled to be here on behalf of the donor and to represent him and his great generosity in giving this Torah to your community here. And my task is to try to help you understand, probably more in the next session, how a Torah is made and how it's, we'll do a bit of that today because you need to understand that. But also what's been done with it, how did it get here, and so forth, and what kinds of things come with it. Certainly how I might suggest it being used in a classroom setting, in ministry and outreach in various ways. So with all of that by background, before I give you a little bit more of my own orientation so you understand how I'm here, let me just say at the outset that this Torah, the technical word for this kind of Torah it's pasul. Pasul means that it's no longer, it can no longer be used in a liturgical setting. And that's very, very important. That word should be a part of your vocabulary because people will misunderstand you're having this and wondering how you could have a kosher Torah and be using it in your classrooms and things, and it could lead to great confusion. Pasul means that it's been decommissioned from use in a liturgical setting, and there are reasons. It's very systematic how that's done, and those decisions are made. Of course, this Torah is 117 feet long. It's written on numerous animal skins, kosher animal skins, and been carefully written. This skin has been prepared in a particular way that helps us to know exactly what it dates to. All that we'll get to in a minute. But to say that over time, when you're using something like this for 100 years, in every year reading through the entire Torah, it's rolling it up, it's unrolling it, it's exposing it to light. This has survived horrendous times historically. And so you put all those things together and think, wow, it's going to need constant loving care because it's written on skin, and ink cracks and fades and things like that. I have to say to you, the first time that I held a manuscript written on vellum, it was an 8th century, unknown 8th century gospel, Greek Gospels, and I turned to John and read that the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And I had a kind of sacramental connection with the text that it's written on skin and is here alive for us, and yet needs to be cared for, because when the ink fades, when letters crack, when in an English letter, kind of with our language, when an E cracks and looks like an I, or it looks like a part of a T or an F, it changes potentially the meaning of the text. And there are some very interesting examples in textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible where that's happened. And so great care watching these things. And as the text is read, it's that process is overseen by the community, by young boys reading from the Torah with the rabbi and reading through and making sure that these things, as they're going through it, that they're cared for. And you all will learn that in your Torah there are our researchers have tabulated 960 corrections. Now, most of those are minor corrections of chipped letters that needed to be corrected and things of that nature, shapes of letters and so forth. But some are much more extensive than that. But the point is, it was a communal activity, and then sophers, the scribe, would go through, carefully monitoring the text. And when it comes to a point where with the community, they no longer can afford to service the Torah, it's placed in a geniza, a storage area. And then depending on the orientation of the Jewish community, it may actually be buried. And you see, in a kind of a Western sense, we have this idea that older texts are better. But certainly from their perspective, older texts potentially are fraught with problems. And it's better to have a perfect new text. And so this is part of the living tradition and culture of Judaism, with the making of Torahs and so forth, and the setting aside Torahs that are considered pasul. This particular Torah, we don't know where it came from exactly. There are stamps on the back of it throughout associated with a synagogue in Israel. That's helpful. But it was probably not produced there. It was produced in Europe. And then after World War II was brought to Israel, it would have been used up until World War II. During that time, it would not have been used. It was set aside and preserved somehow. We don't know how. In some cases, very, very small instances, we know the story of how these scrolls were preserved, but usually not. These things are buried in the memories of those who had them. And when people left the mass exodus of Jews out of Europe, they brought with them scrolls and so forth that had been placed in the geniza and weren't being used anymore. They're not going to leave them. So they bring them with them to Israel, and as part of the, then they're looking for startup funds in Israel. They sell them to a synagogue, they sell them to the government if they can, or to private collectors. And this particular Torah came from the largest private collection of Hebrew Torahs and Hebrew-related manuscripts in the world. And so from Jerusalem, I know the family well. They're delighted that, I mean, they're on holiday now, but they'll be very delighted to know on Sunday that this Torah is here and will be used, and they'll be very happy with that. They've even come to some of these donations to see what happens and so forth. So that's kind of the story of where the Torah came from. It's not in any way encumbered by World War II Nazi war crime laws. It's not encumbered by any kind of laws regulating antiquities, sales, and transmission from Israel. It's not an antiquity. For a Torah scroll to be designated as an antiquity as of the last year and a half, it has to be 300 years old or older. So there's nothing like that. You'll get a legal statement from Todd Hillard that will help alleviate any concerns that you might have that way. The Greens over the summer were fined $3 million for smuggling cuneiform tablets. It's a very different, this is not smuggling anything. This is legally, through legal channels, absolutely appropriate and so forth. Now, I guess, just let me say one more thing and then I'll back up here a second. There are certain questions about how you handle something like this. You understand it's a important religious legacy, but I think you want to be careful not to enshrine it. You want to have accessibility. You want to be able to use it, but you want to respect it for what it is. And it's very important that you make proactively make appropriate inroads with the Jewish community here in the area, with the liberal Reformed rabbis, with the Orthodox and hyper-Orthodox. You're not going to find common ground, and probably it'd be more difficult. We work very closely with them, but for you as an institution, be very careful. This is not your possession. This is something that's come to you from Judaism, and it's something that is owned by all of us as a remnant of our faith. And so to celebrate it as such, I think, is a good move. And there are a lot of ways that can be done that would be very probably wise and well received and so forth. It's likely that a cantor at one of the synagogues here has never read from a Torah this old. What a wonderful opportunity to allow a cantor to come in and to read from the Torah and have your Hebrew students learn, all the others to listen to what's going on and to reconstruct what may have been going on with the description in Luke 4 and this Jesus in the synagogue and so forth. So a lot can be done that would be healthy, I think, all the way around. But pasul is what's important. Some institutions would have you wear gloves and handle this with gloves. From my perspective, gloves, things slip, especially with the coating that's on this. It makes it easy to gloves snag on corners and can tear things. I think from my perspective, and it's kind of training from the British Library and their approach, clean hands, never liquids, never open pens, clean hands is the best way. And then you'll have to decide as an institution whether you're going to let students come up and touch it. And if you do, over time, this whole bottom will turn brown and gray. Just will happen because of the oils and so forth. So you just be careful, figure out, get a committee, figure out who's going to monitor that, make decisions for yourself. Some institutions have decided to do that and others not. And it's just something to think about. Let me just back up a second. And my training is in like ancient texts, ancient languages, ancient manuscripts and things. And I taught at Gordon Conwell and Gordon College, most recently at Baylor in their research post. I did direct Green, Hobby Lobby, now the Museum of the Bible, their collection from no items, 0, to 55,000 items under my direction. So they have about 7,000 scrolls. And so these things I've worked with a lot there and after that. I have a research center now that in part works with Hebrew manuscripts and maintains a database for the study of the manuscripts and research. And we do as well, we work with classical and biblical papyri, unknown things that come to us from collectors. And so very, very important, unknown 2nd century papyri of the New Testament, of the Septuagint earlier. And so that's kind of my world. And then around that we do an international exhibit which will be in Moscow. And so that's why I was coming from Moscow in November and December with Putin and the government there and everything. So it's an exciting opportunity there. But that's kind of my background in all. I've worked with thousands of Torah scrolls. I've had the privilege to do so. We have developed a very careful analysis, detailed, and we have a team of scholars that work with us in our research center, and then we have as well a team of scholars that are associated with the National Library in Israel. We work together. They do things we would never have the bandwidth or capability to do. They're so deep into the analysis of things, and their databases are so rich and full of minor orthographical changes and so forth, lettering, and of course that's important for determining what something dates to and where it comes from and things of that nature. The standard with Torahs, you think, well, they're all the same. They're not. The text is, almost with all, although there's a Torah scroll that we're working with now that has 14 intentional textual anomalies in it, major. And it was well known, and in World War II, it was in Warsaw, World War II, this scroll disappeared. This past year, we were blessed to find an identical copy of it. And so, but for the most part, the text is absolutely 100% identical. But the features that support that are different and vary. How the text was written. And yet, some of the features go all the way back. We can go back to the Leningrad Codex, okay, 1000. We can go back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, the scrolls from the Judean desert. And the writing features there are the same as today. So what you can tell your students, your audience, is that when you're looking at something like this, you're looking, it's a mirror, it's a lens to look all the way back to the time of Jesus and how they copied Scripture. very, very interesting. And so you come face to face with the text and see how it was composed and copied over time. I'll get into more of that in the next session and show you examples of all sorts of things. So this is written on calfskin. It's white. See how white it is? It's because it has a coating. And in this case, the coating, you can see the sheen, is on both sides. It's called mashuach. And the mashuach coating was done between 1860 and 1890. It has 42 lines, which is an aspect of 42 lines of text, which is 178 columns. It's an aspect of a modern meaning post-1600 Torah. So it's got those components, but because of the sheen and the mashuach, what they did this mashuach to preserve the leather, and it makes the ink bright. And so when you look at this, you look and say, gee, that looks like a kosher Torah or something. It looks very vibrant and bright. But it's because of the combination of the ink with that sheen. There are Jewish groups today, and there have been since the 1860s, who've not used mashuach. They see it as being a separation between the ink and the leather of the text. And so there are groups that they would revere this and celebrate it. Don't get me wrong. It's just they wouldn't use it in their synagogue. There is a debate in terms of actually how your particular Torah was made. When you carry it, when you move it about, it's much heavier than a typical Torah. It's because of the sheen that's on it. When it's rolled up, you have a tendency with this to kind of gather the ink on the back side of the scroll. I would suggest, I hope this isn't too random for you. I'm just thinking of things to tell you. I would suggest, I have it open here to the end of Genesis, all of Exodus, and Leviticus picks up here. I would suggest when you roll it up, always roll it one end or the other and not have it kind of halfway meeting. Tie it, not too tight. When it's rolled up, I can go like this and I can tighten it up, but I won't go too tight because it'll crack the ink and crush it. So you don't want to do that. We use bean bags, snakes, and they're kept to keep it from rolling off the table. It gets jarred, it rolls off. The most vulnerable place in the object, the scroll, is actually the seams where they're sewn together. And so that they can tear and twist, and it may be that it does fall or something like that happens. And there's damage. If it happens in the next year, because the way the gifting works is my understanding, I think that the donor technically owns it and carries the insurance on it and stuff. I'm not sure. I think so. And what happens is anything that happens over the course of the next year, if something happens that's damage to it, get it back to us, to our research center. We have a conservator who has gone through and tightened every seam in the kosher way. So everything is done. This is in perfect, tight condition and so forth. But these things can pop and tear, and the seams can come loose, and you just want to make sure, as you're using it, and all those things happen. So you want to be careful, like the Jews in the synagogue, to watch it and see what you have and everything, and realize you're dealing with an old object that's seen a lot of wear and tear, and care for it. So don't roll it up too tight. Roll it to one end or the other so it's not in the middle and get twisted and bunched up. I would get a sash and tie it. One in the middle is fine. This is very sturdy. If it was a softer leather, I'd probably say two so it doesn't bind it in the middle. It doesn't have, you have staves here that were used for rolling, but it doesn't come with it doesn't come with the rollers. And sometimes institutions have decided they would go ahead and make them. And I should say that in the context of our supporting donors, with the research and all, we've very happily, if we've had opportunity, gone and spoken at schools. So on Monday and Tuesday, we're in Philadelphia at Westminster for another donor that's giving a Torah there. And I was at Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte a week and a half ago or something. So I think that we've probably done, one donor alone has done 50 or 60. So some seminaries, went ahead and had rollers made. Personally, I wouldn't do it. They're clunky. They make it heavier to carry around. You've got to get a bigger case to put them in. Then they don't fit in the case that comes with it. It's not a big deal, but they're not part of the object. And so, once you learn gently to roll it and everything, you'll be fine to be able to do it without that, I think. That's my personal opinion. But I would keep it as straight as possible, and I would keep it rolled. I would make sure it wouldn't roll off the table, and be careful. You have observed no vowels, no chapters, no verses. So how do we navigate with our database? Well, what we've done is we've gone and we've numbered on the backside in pencil on the bottom every column. And then we've numbered every sheet or skin or panel. Okay? So here, this is column 135. This is skin 31 and 134 there. And all of our entries in the database, when we get into textual features, you see on the bottom, they're all tagged what skin it comes from, what column it's in, and what line it's on. So you're able to go immediately where you need to go. Otherwise, you just not be able to find anything. So when we talked about 960 corrections, every one of those has been described in this up here, and you can go and find any given one of them. You can find where they've cut out the skin and replaced it. You can find where a line was missed and they put it in, and you can go through with something like that and do all kinds of neat things with the study of that. And by the way, I would just say, and I'll say this in the next session more emphatically, but you all are fully aware of this. Someone could come up and say, 960 errors, 960 mistakes. My response is 960 corrections. You know, this is something that's been very carefully maintained and corrected over time so that it's right, but not done by magic. It's done by hard work, by a community committed to it. So in this Excel sheet, there are also indications. I'm just looking down here. I see a correction there. I see one there, and I see marks here by people indicating corrections that need to be made. There are 3 different people because there are 3 different kinds of marks. So it shows a process of what's going on here. When you throw yourself into this, you come to understand the wonderful complexity of its production and preservation over time. Awesome. So you've got columns, you've got skins, and they relate to this. You also have a complete set of high-resolution, perfect images of the scroll itself that can be used in that way. Let me see. Of course, well, mention that. I think that kind of gives a little bit of an introduction to some of this. In teaching, I've had the wonderful privilege of working with a lot of rare unknown stuff, and personally, I'm not geared toward consuming that myself without engaging students and mentoring students in the process. And so our research center has a program, 5 years running quarterly in Nairobi with a consortium of universities and seminaries, and in Nigeria with a consortium of universities and seminaries. And we've got 40 PhDs and PhD students where we bring them manuscripts and train them on how to handle them and work with them and mentor them and inspire them to study the languages, to hope to bring a different dimension to Christian scholarship, to decolonize it a bit, and to return. I lovingly refer to these scholars that were committed to the program, absolutely to them, but as my Ivy League scholars. And they have the privilege of handling and touching and working with things and learning about it in an area where Christianity is burgeoning. You know, this is the scales are going to be tipped, and this is where this will be the epicenter of Christianity, and we want Christian scholars there who have had the ability to work with things. So there are all kinds of neat things that can and should be done with your Torah in the classroom with students, not merely language related, but all kinds of things. Whatever you teach, take a day teaching on how the Bible was composed and transmitted, and use your Torah to show them, and take some features and actually show them how it was written and done, to give them a stronger, more sensible and reasonable sense of hope in the Word by understanding the process. So neat things that can be done that way. Things in history that can be done about of course, the history of Judaism, and ideas about Jewish religion and practices and so forth, and the reading of the Torah, and to understand that, and to give a strong sense of the Judeo-Christian origins of our faith. That's important. I think whatever discipline you're in, something can be done that incorporates this, and I would be careful not to guard against having it become one person's thing. It's shared by the community and all of you working together and so forth. Maybe a small committee that oversees who gets it when, and you get the calendar out and you figure it out and everything. But there's some share with each other different ways in which it can be used. There are research-related things that can be done with students seminary students. I told you there are 960. You've got where they all are. Give them an assignment. Assign to them a book, and tell them to find every correction and every correction. There are no variations. Every correction that's been made. Well, they've got to carefully go through and do that, and then you can tabulate it against what the experts have seen. It will get them into the text to look at. Even they don't know Hebrew, it doesn't matter. They're engaged with the text and can see certain things with it. It would be a great experience. I had, for many years at the graduate and undergraduate level, required every semester students to hand copy their own, and I would assign an ancient text in Greek or in Hebrew or Coptic or whatever, and they sometimes would make their own skins, or we use papyrus, and I would tell them if they made one mistake, I'd fail the whole class. Well, they took the project seriously. They made all kinds of mistakes, but they worked together to try to make it do the best job that they possibly could do, and they learned a lot about how a text was transmitted over time. So there are wonderfully creative things that you can do with this that go way beyond teaching Hebrew. Teaching Hebrew is great. You can do that. You can have them read the Ten Commandments and read different sections of popular texts of Scripture, and that would be fine. Or follow through with the reading of the Torah during the year, and selectively take a reading and say, this is what's being read in the synagogue. If you're a New Testament person, Yeah, there are all kinds of overlap there as well with the use of the Torah in the synagogue and the text transmission and all of that is just, it's filled with all kinds of things that can be done. But if you're doing it every year, every semester, I mean, it won't get old. And as students are cycled through, a lot can be learned. You can, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you mentioned reading along with the liturgical calendar. Does this have the Seminary marked in it?
No. Sorry. Don't mark it either.
No, I wouldn't. I wasn't going to add. I was just questioning if they had already put the Seminary.
No, yeah, that would be harder. But nevertheless, there are things you can do with the community as well. Gee, with people in the church here, with people in the broader community. It's around that time of year where the reading of the Torah is finished and the dancing with the Torahs, and a synagogue would be delighted to have your Torah involved in that ceremony. There are things that could be done that then require students to see what goes on in a synagogue and to learn about Judaism and so forth. So there are wonderful bridges can be built that way. There's a family that gave a Torah to Bethel College and Seminary a couple years ago. And a professor of Jewish studies from University of Minnesota came into the session. And he was sitting there, and he was like levitating on his seat. He was like holding himself from springing up. And I was wondering, I wonder what's going to happen. And he got up, he sprung up at the end of the presentation, and he said, "You all don't understand what you're getting." He said, "I went to UPenn and never had an opportunity to look at something like this. And now, you know, they fully understand it, and there may be inroads that can be done with the university and all. So, the great possibilities. I would be careful monitoring how social media handles this, and students with, you know, a selfie next to the new Torah, and getting online and getting out there. You want to be careful to monitor that right from the beginning. So how that's done, figure it out, give cautions, and respectful, and all of that while wanting to engage them at the same time. What kind of questions do you have? Yeah.
Do you recommend, like, some of the synagogues said, we would love to show this in our synagogue, loaning it out? Or
Yeah, the question, if a synagogue wants to show it in their synagogue, personally, if I were on your committee doing it, I'd say do it. What a wonderful opportunity. You know, very special, and yes, so there's nothing to lose in that at all, and everything to gain. I was at Purdue University with an event. We do things supporting Josh McDowell and Ravi Zacharias, and who are incorporating things like this into their teaching. Josh McDowell said, the use of the Torah in teaching how the Bible was transmitted is the most significant tool he's ever encountered in 60 years of teaching. So this is, a lot of creative things can be done with this that can help someone understand how the Bible is transmitted. At Purdue, the cantor, faculty member who was a cantor, was asked to read from the Torah that was being gifted there, and he said, almost in tears, he'd never read. He's read around the world. He's read in Israel. He's never read from a Torah that old, because they're all modern Torahs that he's reading from. So they're real special things that could be done, you know. And if they're not interested in doing it, that's fine. Maybe some other time. But questions? Pasul, yep. P-A-S-U-L.
Well, the only equivalent in biblical Hebrew is pesel, but that's image. What do we
Yeah, Pasul is, yeah, yeah.
Is
It,
it Pesamic or Pacine?
yeah. I'll get you the derivation on it. It technically means disqualified.
So it must be just a modern Hebrew term.
Yeah, medieval, rabbinical. Yeah. I'll get to you all. I have a 19th century work on laws for the Sofer. And these things evolve over time, very hard to come by. Usually they're in Hebrew. This is in English. And I'll find, we'll get someone from our staff to send to you all here so you can have, it'll be a digital copy, but it goes through all the laws and regulations and everything. It's kind of interesting to read.
Another thing I just ask is to help us learn from others, both here. You've said some stories of some things that, done that have worked out really well. Would love to hear so we don't repeat the mistakes of others. What unintended disasters have you seen? Just, like, ooh, somebody thought this was a good idea, or they weren't watching out for this, just so if I hear a couple of stories, that may help us to avoid making some of the same mistakes.
Yeah, I don't hear too much of that because I interface with a campus and
Okay.
talk, and it's not always, and so I can't say. The things I could imagine would be offending the Jewish community. Not having a ready answer for someone who comes at you and says, this is a Nazi, stolen from the Nazis, or, what's the provenance and how do we, they're very concrete answers to all of that. And no, so it's more how you're perceived by the public, or could be perceived, but usually we've had this kind of discussion and people pick up on it pretty quickly. Maybe some pictures to get out in advance to people thinking about policy. I've not heard. I'm sure there are. You all will be part of a broader consortium of institutions that have these. So Northwestern has one. Bethel has one. Trinity has one in Chicago. Trinity International. I'm just thinking here in the area, but we're trying to incorporate opportunities for collaborative research where it would not be with your Torah or their Torah. We've selected one that is absolutely publishable, rare, significant in every way, and are inviting faculty and select students to be part of a year-long research project that results in papers and a publication. So if that's something that might be of interest to somebody, we'll be back in touch with the appropriate people, and it hasn't begun yet. And so
Are there some resources that could be made available to our faculty in terms of just as teaching aids? I know that there was some mention of a slide or video images of all of the pages of the scroll.
well, we have digital images of everything. We did not with your Torah. It's time consuming, but we have created, and could help you all to know how to do it, create what we've called a digital Torah, where the images are stitched together, and then you can embed the aspects into the scroll, and you can go and either search from a drop-down menu for whatever, and it pulls it up like a large image file with links embedded in it. But we don't have that created. We've only done that a few times just because of the cost and time and everything. But that can be done, and that reduces the handling of it and all of that, and helps to preserve it a bit. But other resources and things, I'll have to think what might be available. I don't know.
Just walking along, probably around the middle of Exodus, looked like the spacing was quite pronounced in
Yeah.
certain spots. Could you tell us about that?
Sure can. There are a number of passages in the Torah where they formatted them differently. And the Song of the Sea, which is our Exodus 15, and the Song of Moses in the end of Deuteronomy are paginated differently because they're poetry. And also probably because the Song of the Sea actually has visual significance, and I'll show it in the next session what that would be. But this is something that actually goes back to, we don't have the whole Torah from the scrolls of the Judean desert. We have fragments of, and lengthy pieces of some things, but we do have a fragment of Exodus 15. And the fragment of Exodus 15 is paginated, is exactly the same way. So, so it's one thing to say, I know the Bible's true because it's the same text that the Dead Sea Scrolls had, or virtually. It's another thing to say, I know the Bible's true, or been truthfully transmitted, because the way they did it is the same. Not merely the text, but actually the way it was written and written out and spaced out and everything was the same over time, which is pretty interesting. So 10 Commandments are done that way. The Aaronic priestly blessing, the curses from Mount Ebal are all done, paginated differently. And while they'll look kind of like they're the same from scroll to scroll to scroll, from tradition to tradition and over time, they vary. So it's also a feature that's used for us to know what something dates to. Just as a heads up, the earliest complete Torah that I'm aware of is 13th century. Then, of course, you have fragments that are earlier than that in the Carroll and with Qumran and so forth. But 13th century is the earliest complete Torah. And it's one in the collection that you have, yours came from. It's in that collection and was radiocarbon dated and dated on other bases.
So you're
To
talking
that.
about scrolls, not codexes.
Scrolls, right. Yeah, codices, you have the Leningrad Codex is 1007 to 1010, yeah. So and the Aleppo Codex and so forth. But no, talking about complete Hebrew Torah scrolls. The earliest is 13th century. There was one thought to be that was thought to be the earliest, which was like 14th, late 13th from Italy, was discovered a couple of years ago, but now this radiocarbon dated one's earlier. So, but they're not that much earlier, really, as things go. Questions about handling, about study, about how to navigate it.
So are we generally probably looking at an 80-year-old scroll?
With Mashuach, they began doing Mashuach on the backside first, and then transitioned to do it on both sides. This is on both sides. So 1860 to 1890. So you're looking at 120, 130 years. But I think the operative is, in a case like this, those were big 130 years because of World War II and all. Very historic. Based on the number of synagogues that are active today and the number of estimated scrolls per synagogue, and based on the number of scrolls in private collections that we're aware of, my guess is that there are 20,000 scrolls in the world. Okay? And most of those are more modern than yours. All right? So as you go back further and further, they become more and more rare.
Well, I wonder if we should take, a 5-minute break here.
It's great,
and
yeah.
allow other folks to come in for the 4:30 time slot. And I would assume you're willing to engage with our faculty.
Of
if they
course,
have additional
yeah.
questions and whatever, but thank you for
Yeah, pleasure, yeah.
very, very
So, yeah, well, we'll really start showing you things in the next session, so if you're able to stay. Any other questions? You have other?
Can you say something about the value of this or the range of value? I mean, it's not a
sale item, but I have a new concept.
Yeah, okay, and this is, here's the answer to that. It's priceless. Bottom line, that's it. There are professionals who do appraised values. I'm not, I don't do that.
Let me ask you, what's a new one cost?
No,
If they just wanna buy a new one, you
wait,
replace
slow down. There's, when an appraisal is done by a specialist who works with these things, they have to have a comparanda. They have to have something they compare it with. And they go to the finest auction houses. So the Christie's and the Sotheby's and the finest Judaica auction houses. And they're able to set what the market will tolerate for something. And that fluctuates. There are things that are bought at auction that are bought inexpensively, and there are things that are crazy. But it's a good way to think about it. What does a new one cost? That varies. But let me put it this way. It takes a trained sofer, somebody with many years, someone like this would have 20, 30 years of experience, and having been trained for 10 years. It would take them a full year. That's not your raw materials, that's not 40 cows, skins, and all of that. It's a full year's wage for a highly trained professional. And so it varies. Now, you can go to, I've never bought a thing on eBay in my life. I confess, even looked at it. But I'm told you can go to eBay and find something for $20,000, a scroll. Or what happens is, buyer beware. They take fragments of scrolls and put them together, and you have a mishmash, a kind of Frankenstein thing that is, now sometimes they're also undersold, but it's what we would call junk sales. Not reflecting on the Torah at all, but just you can't determine the price of a Torah value based on the low-end things. It's more, what are things selling at Christie's and Sotheby's and all? What's a new one sell for? And then you say, okay, if a new one sells for $70,000, what is one that's 130 years old that survived the Holocaust? Okay, and so that's, and people, I don't do it, but people who do begin to factor those things and make determinations then for insurance purposes or tax purposes or something. But the best way to answer it, I would say, for your institution, is people will ask, is to just say it's priceless.
And I understood you to say that the donors insure.
I don't know. That's typically what's done, is the donor will cover the insurance for a year. If not the donor, then maybe Todd Hillard has. Has Todd done it? I don't know. I don't know. But we'll have Todd make sure that you all know who's doing that and how it's done.